Hi, everyone. I want to give you my highlights, my top 10 for Mounce Chapters 12 and 13. Let's begin with Chapter 12. Chapter 12 is all about personal pronouns. In sections 1 through 3 of Chapter 12, 12.1 through 3, Mounce reviews English pronouns for you, along with some terminology, some terms, and some concepts about how pronouns work to refresh your memory. One thing to notice, what Mounce calls an antecedent, other New Testament teachers, like me, who teach the Greek New Testament, call this the referent of a pronoun, the word that it refers back to, the referent. Antecedent and referent mean the same thing. My second tip for you in the top 10 for Chapter 12 comes out of section 12.4. Mounce says in that section, the case of a pronoun in English is determined by its function. And in terms of morphology, how the word looks, how it's spelled, even in English sometimes, the case of the pronoun and the way that it's spelled will vary. The spelling, sometimes even in English pronouns, varies because of the way the case is used. My tip number 3 for you has to do with Chapter 12, sections 5 and 6. In that section, Mounce tells you that Greek words, like English, work the same way when it comes to pronouns. Number and gender will match the referent or the antecedent of the pronoun, the noun that it refers back to. But, and this is an important but, listen carefully. I'll keep saying this to you. There is no need to memorize any of the forms. Mounce says you should memorize forms in these sections. Don't do it. Your biblical software will do the heavy lifting of recognizing the form and the way that it's spelled and analyzing its case and number and gender properly for you. Your biblical software will do that. No need for you to memorize. Your biblical software will also give you a gloss, a kind of basic definition, and in accordance, all you need to do to see all of these things is just pause your cursor over the word. In Logos, same way. Just pause your cursor over the word. You'll see the grammatical analysis and you'll get a gloss. If you're using GNT Reader, you'll have to click on the word to see the grammatical analysis on the top right and the definition just under that from Abbott Smith Lexicon. My fourth tip from Chapter 12 is with reference to sections 7 through 9 in Chapter 12, 12.7 through 9. And it's to say to you, these are not really important sections. Why? Because of what I've just told you. You don't need to memorize forms because your software will do the recognition and the analysis for you. My last tip for Chapter 12, short top 10 list, just 5 tips. My last tip concerns Chapter 12 and Section 10. And it's to tell you, this is interesting information, but it's only interesting information concerning translations. It's something that you need to read through, but you don't need to try to remember it. Now, Chapter 13, on the other hand, is about modifiers. And this is a long chapter, but it's not really very complicated. What Mounce is trying to do for you in this chapter is give you some working definitions about all of the different ways that words can be modified, how the sentence can be expanded to become more descriptive about the subject, or more descriptive about the action of the verb, or more descriptive about the object or indirect object. Modifiers modify those 4 main parts of the sentence, and they describe them more fully for you so that more meaning can emerge through the sentence as a whole. So my first tip for you concerns Chapter 13 and sections 1 through 4. Again, there is no need to memorize forms for the definite article. Your software will recognize and analyze the forms of the definite article correctly for you in every case. But because the definite article matches the word that it modifies, it will always be, as Mounce says, in the same case and number and gender as the word that the definite article modifies. My tip number 2 for you comes out of chapter 13 and sections 5, 6, and 7. This is information that's good to know. Sometimes Greek will have a definite article in front of something, and your English translation will not. Don't try to translate the definite article, but do remember that for the New Testament writer, the idea is something definite. You won't be able to get it into English necessarily, but the idea is something is definite. Works the other way around too. You will not always find a definite article where your English translation will have one. English requires a definite article in places where Greek doesn't. My tip number 3 comes from chapter 13 and sections 8 and 9. These sections talk to you about adjectives, and they tell you adjectives can work the same way in Greek as in English. They can work, surprise, surprise, adjectivally. What does an adjective do? An adjective modifies and describes a noun. Greek adjectives can do that too. Greek adjectives have other uses too. You'll meet them later on in Mounce. Don't worry about them now. My 4th tip for you comes from chapter 13 and section 10. This says agreement works for adjectives in the same way as agreement worked for the definite article. The adjective will agree with the noun that is modifying in case and number and gender. But do notice, adjectives can be put in a variety of places in the Greek sentence, and in places that English speakers would not necessarily expect the adjective to be placed. English works on word order, Greek does not. In section 11 through 13 of chapter 13, you'll find my 5th tip. This is an important definition. What is a phrase? A phrase is a group of words that lacks a subject or verb. And phrases have different names depending on how they function grammatically in the sentence. Phrases, though, are always dependent. And that means, grammatically, they depend on what they modify to make meaning. They modify something, but they cannot make meaning on their own. They will not stand alone in the sentence. They will not make sense if you try to make that happen grammatically. You'll see how that works out later when we come to talk more about phrasing. My 6th tip concerns chapter 13 and sections 14 through 16. We've already talked about prepositions back in Mounce chapter 6. Most of this is about how prepositions can be used with a case or with more than one case. And when they're used with more than one case, each case will create its own unique meaning with the preposition. Mounce also talks about how morphology or spelling changes sometimes, but you know not to pay attention to those discussions now, because your software will analyze and recognize morphology and spelling and inflection. Tip number 7 concerns chapter 13 and sections 17 through 20. These sections talk about prepositional phrases. And as Mounce says, most prepositional phrases, most frequently they're adverbial. They modify verbs. But they can also be used in an attributive sense. That means they are attributing something to a noun. They're modifying nouns. Remember, when something is in italics or in boldface in Mounce, it's a term associated with the grammatical analysis of Greek. If you forget the meaning of the term, the best place to go is your pocket dictionary. For example, see the word adverbial defined on page 15 in your pocket dictionary. My 8th tip for you from chapter 13 comes from section 21. This section defines a clause for you, and it's important to remember the definition. A clause is a group of words that includes a verb and a subject. The subject can be expressed, it can be written, or it can be implied in the verb. But a clause will always contain a verb and a subject. Remember, when Greek uses a verb, it can automatically be translated as a pronoun. And so, for example, Greek can write one word and mean I love without having to write I as a separate word like English does. So that's what I mean when I say clauses are a group of words with a verb and a subject. And the subject can be expressed, written out, or it can be implied in the verb. My tip number 9 for you concerns chapter 13 in sections 22 through 28. These sections explain relative pronouns. Relative pronouns are found in relative clauses. And relative pronouns in relative clauses always modify what they refer back to. They're referent, they're antecedent. They give that more definition, like Mounce explains in chapter 13 and section 22, and in chapter 13 and section 27. Don't worry about forms. He talks about them in 13:24 through 25. Your software is going to sort them out for you. And don't fuss too much about 13.28 and think you have to remember it. Your English translation will show you what it is. You have the Pocket Dictionary too. For example, see the definition for the word substantival in your Pocket Dictionary. It's found on page 117. My last tip for you about chapter 13, this long chapter, is about the last two sections, 29 and 30. You need to understand the difference between a dependent and an independent clause. And I'm going to turn around the way I explain it to you and do it backwards from the way that Mounce does. I want you to start with the understanding of an independent clause. An independent clause can stand all by itself. It makes meaning alone. A dependent clause cannot stand all by itself. It doesn't make sense alone. That's the difference. Independent stands alone. Dependent cannot stand alone. I hope these tips highlight important points for you in a way that is simpler to understand perhaps than all of the extra information that Mounce provides for you. But if you have questions about anything, please don't hesitate to drop me an email and ask.